Well, I'm excited to be back today with my new friend, Dr. Javad Hashmi, who, in case you haven't seen the last episode, which you really should before you watch this one, it's a lot of good foundational stuff that has been set up in that. But just in case you didn't, let me reintroduce him again real quick. He is a board-certified emergency physician. He's a former fellow of medical ethics at Harvard Medical School, and he's a PhD candidate in the study of religion, Islamic Studies at Harvard University. And in addition to his medical training, Dr. Hashmi holds a bachelor's and master's degree in Arabic and Islamic Studies from UC Berkeley and Harvard, respectively. In the last episode, we had a really great conversation kind of talking about Javad's story and where he's kind of been on the pro-life issue. And we had a good discussion about human exceptionalism, personhood, all kinds of really fun things. So now that we've kind of gotten to know Javad better, we thought it would be really cool. This is actually Javad's idea today. It was like, let's look at the different ways that Islamic intellectuals have talked about abortion specifically, including even maybe some YouTube videos from some pretty big names in that community, so that Javad can kind of compare and contrast his views with other different views, just so we can understand. It is not new for me to say the pro-life movement needs to be a diverse place. We are not going to be a very effective force for change if society sees us as just a whole bunch of white middle-income Catholics or something like that. Like, this is a really, really cool opportunity to learn from someone who is probably different than a lot of our kind of typical listeners. And that's exciting for me. So I'm just so glad to have you on, Javad. Welcome back to the show. And I can't wait to hear what you're going to tell us today.
Thanks so much, Josh. So I wanted to start out with just taking a look at some statistics.
Yeah.
So I wanted to show you what the views about abortion are amongst American Muslims. So if you look at this Pew survey, hopefully you can see it. You see that 55% of American Muslims believe that abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And only 37% are kind of in that pro-life camp, you could say. So it's a significant majority who are pro-choice.
Is that polling Americans or is that polling all Muslims?
I'm pretty sure that it's just American Muslims here.
That makes sense.
Yeah. I think if you polled around the globe, the number would be much lower.
Yes.
Now, which does tell you that context matters. So I am a budding scholar of religion, and I'm not trying to say that there's only one religious view, like Islam says X, Y, and Z. No, there's different ideas with different thinkers. And I do think my view is the correct view, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other views as well.
Yes.
So we see that a majority of American Muslims believe or kind of take the pro-choice view. And I want to kind of dig deeper and figure out why that is, and then what I kind of see as the problems with that kind of perspective. So the next thing I wanted to show you, if you don't mind, is an article. It's a great website. It's AltMuslimah.com. It's a great website otherwise. And like I said, I'm an Islamic liberal. I try to promote Muslim women voices, including women academics and intellectuals. But here is a woman that obviously I disagree with, but I just wanted to show you an article and then see what the thinking is. And then we can see why someone would reach that position based on what some of the verbiage is coming from Islamic religious clerics or the ulama, the clerical establishment, and their representatives. So here is an article. I'm a Muslim woman and I chose to have an abortion. So the key part here is if you kind of scroll down, she basically says, in beginning to consider an abortion, I looked first to the law, that is Islamic law. Islamic law makes allowances for abortion up to 16 weeks into the pregnancy and beyond when the mother's life is at risk. Okay, so this is what she is getting from the Islamic clerical establishment, the traditional establishment. I'm going to problematize this view, but I want to show what the result or the consequence is of how kind of some of the traditional voices are expressing themselves. So basically, the standard line amongst Muslim thinkers is Islam is neither pro-choice nor pro-life. Rather, there's this thing in Islamic tradition of wanting to strike the middle grounds, and that's a long history. But here, there's the attempt to say we're neither pro-life nor pro-choice. We're kind of down in the middle. You can't group us into either box. But what I want to show is that in reality, this translates into a pro-choice view. Because if you're saying that, we'll see why that is. But you can see that this Muslim woman, who is an academic herself, interprets what the clerics are saying and goes in this pro-choice direction. And we'll see why that is. Before I go even further, I wanted to show what Twitter has been saying, because I did say that I'm going to come on your show. I like this comment from someone. Oh, they're being respectful, sort of. I will give your views a patient hearing, no matter how wrong they are. So,
okay, how open-minded.
Neither science nor religion can pinpoint the exact time a fetus becomes fully human. And then, so there's one argument here, and then there's a second argument here. Using any pretext to justify a so-called pro-life position inherently marginalizes women. So I'm trying to look at the two basic arguments that are used to kind of promote this view amongst Muslims. The first is that science nor religion can tell you when something becomes fully human. I think that's false. I think science does tell us when you become a human being.
I want to just ask you the clarification question we always ask anyone on either side who says something like that. Do you mean that science can tell us when someone becomes biologically a member of the human species? Or do you mean that science can tell us when someone even becomes, well, no, I guess just human species, because you're a human exceptionalist. You don't have a personhood part of your view, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
So I'm saying that scientifically, biologically, we say that a fetus is part of the human species and is a human being. So it's different than, so one of the standard arguments is, well, my fingernail is also human. But nobody says if I cut that off that it's going to be a problem. No, I'm making a difference between a part that is a human and a whole human being. So the fetus is a whole human being. It has the right set of chromosomes. It matches the definition. So my kind of algorithm is quite simple. I say, is it a human being? Is it a whole organism, that is? And is it alive? Right. And if it checks those marks, then I say, if it checks those criteria, then I say it should have equal moral status. That is, there is a basic human status that is afforded to it, and that makes it sacred or sacrosanct. And this is what's called in the Quran, hurmat an-nafs, or sanctity of the soul, sanctity of the self. And this is kind of that human exceptionalism that I'm talking about.
Right. So just to summarize real quick, for if there's anyone that didn't listen to the last episode, and probably like the bonus discussion that I put in full so that everyone could hear the full discussion, there's so much common ground between Javad and me. But one interesting point where we just think differently, which is fine, and we're not really here to have a whole debate about it, but just for clarity for at least our people, the move here that Javad is doing would be to say, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, but I don't think I will at this point. I think I understand, is that we know scientifically it's human, it's biologically human. And then
it's a human being, especially.
It is a human being. And by human being, correct, it is a whole human, whole human organism.
Yes.
And for religious reasons specifically, and like upfront, like that's the reason that you believe that your whole members of the human species are valuable and have rights, have moral status and things like that. What you are not doing that pro-lifers even like me do is to say they are a person because of something that they have, like intrinsic ability to think and act morally or something like that. That's the human exceptionalism versus personhood kind of difference. And this is like, top 1% of pro-lifers like debate this kind of thing. Like this is like super relevant to everyone. I just at least want for clarity, here's what Javad means when he says that in the way that is contrasted with the way that we often talk about personhood over here.
I think that's correct how you presented my position. I would say there's probably more back and forth that we could go into about this, where I'm not totally opposed to something that you're saying, but I don't put any further condition. I just say that the reasons why it might be something, but the condition is only that it's a human being. And that confers upon, as long as it's an alive human being, that confers on it equality and sanctity of life. So that's the first move that I make. And I just wanted to show viewers, if you're interested in the science, so I do think liberals take science seriously. And this is just one of those times in which I don't think they take it seriously because it doesn't match up with the viewpoint they want to reach to. And so I think the science backs the pro-life position. This is a good article by Professor Irving. When do human beings begin? Scientific myths and scientific facts. So that's a good article if you wanted to look into this deeper. I'm not going to get into this right now, but just for your viewers. And maybe we can put that link up for the viewers. Now, the other thing I wanted to show is the different percentages of why people get abortions. Because amongst Muslim audiences specifically, it's always about, we focus on rape and incest. And we make this as we saw in that tweet, we make it a women's rights issue. But what we see is, if we look at the statistics, and this, I'm going to butcher how to pronounce it, even though I've studied how to read German, my pronunciation is terrible, but I guess it's the Guttmacher Institute. Would you say that any better?
I typically hear Guttmacher, so yeah, okay. I think that's right.
Okay. So it is a pro-choice research institution. So this is where we get these statistics from. We see that this is, they polled, why do people get abortions? And again, abortions are very common. 1 in 4 American women get an abortion. There's year upon year, there's about 1 million people who get abortions. It's dropped a little bit below that, but about 1 million abortions per year. And the vast majority of them would not be for fetal reasons, like fetal health reasons or anything like that. So we look at the percentages here. Percent of rape is less than 0.5%. All right. And incest, by the way, is a similar less than 0.5%. So the question that comes to mind, we're gonna have to talk about the issue of rape and incest. But the point is that we shouldn't use the less than 0.5% to justify the 99%. And if we look at the reasons why people get abortions, I think many Muslims would be uncomfortable with the reasons. And it would contrast with the reasons that Islamic clerics give for either allowing or disallowing it. So if you look, fetal health problems are only 3%. Mother's physical health problems, which is kind of undifferentiated. What does that mean? Is it really a life-threatening situation or not?
Right.
I think that's something that we need to look at. But the bottom line is that any things that I would consider, that many Muslims would consider like the legitimate reasons, is we're talking about a few percentage points. The rest are things that I think many Muslims would feel uncomfortable with. That is, that women think that it would interfere with their education or career. Now, I am a big women's rights advocate within Islam. I believe in full legal equality, full legal political equality, which, by the way, is not a just accepted opinion in the Islamic world. Like, it is something that I am on the liberal side of the spectrum. I'm arguing for full legal and political equality for women. And I believe that they should be fully educated, go to universities, work in the workplace. I believe in abolishing the barda, which is like extreme segregation, where traditionally women were confined to a quarter of their house, called the zanana or the harem. I obviously believe in abolishing that. And it is, I mean, come on, there's only very limited places where that's done, but I'm opposed to that. I'm also opposed to the face veil. I don't think that a law should be passed banning it, but I do, from a religious standpoint, I do think that we should be telling people to move away from it religiously. And only a tiny percentage of Muslim women do that. But the other, as far as the headscarf, I believe that's a free choice of a woman to either do or not to do. But the point is that on many issues, I fall under the women-friendly interpretations of Islam and the Quran. So don't try to kind of impute to me this kind of misogynistic worldview. And that's why I'm taking this, pro-life view. That's not the case. In fact, I would say that if we lived in an alternate world, if we lived in India, for example, and India was the superpower and all the discourse was Indian, over there, infanticide and abortions are done on a sex selective basis. So females are aborted. And this goes back to what I was talking about in the last episode that we did, where female infanticide was done in pre-Islamic Arabia and is condemned in the Quran. And so I think if we lived in an alternate world and we all lived in India, I would say that liberals and women's rights advocates might actually just take for granted that we should be pro-life and anti-abortion since it's so selective against females. So I don't think it necessarily means that you're anti-woman if you're taking a pro-life viewpoint.
Yeah.
Half of those fetuses, at least, are females, if not a greater percentage in parts of the world where females would be aborted and not males. And that includes much of the Muslim majority world, despite the fact that our Islamic tradition heavily emphasizes that you should not discriminate against your female child, and that you should actually, there's a saying that if you raise 2 daughters, you're going to be promised, certain reward and all this kind of stuff. So anyways, the point here is that I wanted to go through the percentages, that most of these percentages have to do with work, career, and the fact that I don't want to raise a child at this point in time. Either I'm a single mom, I have other children, or I can't afford a baby. This is going to be an important one because Islamic clerics oppose not having children based on the fear of not being able to raise that child. This is a theological reason why they have for opposing this. And we'll see that in the videos that we go into. And I'll show you why I think this is true. But I also think that they kind of misinterpret it a little bit, but we'll get into that. And then we see that, they're not ready for a child. So if you look at the vast majority of the reasons, it's because they're just not ready or they don't want to have kids. It's an elective reason for not wanting to have kids. And if you look at this, the percentages line up. This is just done from Florida. But again, rape is not even it's just 0.1%.
Yeah.
So incestuous relationship is 0.01%.
Yeah.
Now, I did tell people that I'm coming from a more modernist trajectory, but I didn't want to limit and say that it's only a modernist who would say this. I'm quoting here Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who is the probably most well-known and respected traditionalist scholar in America, Islamic scholar, and I have great respect for him. His article is probably the exception of what I viewed, and I would strongly recommend Muslims to read his article because I think he gets it right. So he takes a minority view, which is the historical Maliki view, which is against abortion completely. So he is someone that I consider pro-life. And I think he's also in conversation because he is part of the Graduate Theological Union in California. So he's in conversation with Christian interlocutors. And I think that has left an effect, just like it has left an effect on me, that he agrees with that point of view. So I would strongly recommend people. So even though I'm a modernist, there's a traditional scholar who's pretty much saying the exact same things as I am. So that's
links to all of these in the description. If you want to read all of these things, we're going to make it really easy for you. You don't just have to take Javad's word for it.
Thanks so much. And then now I wanted to move to a YouTube clip. And I wanted to show what kind of the mainstream view is, because Sheikh Hamza's view is actually a minority view. It's one of the 4 schools of thought which historically was strongly against abortion. But this is what I'm going to show next is by the Yaqeen Institute. This is by Dr. Suleiman, Imam Umar Suleiman, who is a very well-respected figure. I respect him a lot. I like him a lot. He's the imam that my wife really follows and likes, and the women in my group like, men also. I mean, because he's very open-minded, compassionate, and we like him a lot. I do think he gets this issue wrong, but I want to respectfully engage with his view, which also represents kind of the mainstream view. So, and by the way, by the end of this, Josh, you're going to become an expert in Islamic law. All right.
Yay! Something that I don't know enough about.
But you will, I think by the end of this, you will actually have a better awareness of the Islamic viewpoint than many average Muslims. So
I find that really valuable. Thank you.
All right. We ready to begin then?
Yes.
All right. So this is the first idea that complicates things. And I didn't talk about this at all in my last clip.
Right.
In our
I
last
thought about
episode.
asking you about it, but I knew we were going to get more into it in this episode. This one's not new to me.
Okay. So there's the idea that God breathes the soul into the fetus at a certain point of time.
Yeah.
The problem is that Muslim thinkers and Muslim scholars historically have disagreed about what that timestamp is. So there's a debate. Some say 40 days, some say 120 days. Those are the two, and there's other viewpoints as well, but those are the two most common, 40 days and 120 days.
Yeah.
Now, what ends up happening is that Islamic scholars tend to take the view that, okay, before 40 days, we're going to be more lenient. After 40 days, we'll be a little bit more stringent. And then after 120 days, we're going to be extremely stringent. Okay. So after 120 days, they pretty much become, after that point in time, pro-life, you can say. But the problem with this is that if you're allowing abortion up to 120 days, in reality, in my viewpoints, that translates to a pro-choice view. Yep. Because as we know, as pro-choice advocates themselves mention, the vast majority of abortions take place before the 120 days.
Correct.
So there's actually this dissonance between what the Islamic clerics are saying on the one hand, and the leaders are saying, the religious leaders, and what the American Muslim community is taking from that on the other. So the American Muslim community in general understands that this means that we're pro-choice, because if we're allowing it before 120 days, really we're pro-choice. But the Islamic religious clerics, they want to claim that they're pro-life because they don't want to be associated with being pro-choice. Because clearly we do value human life and we want to fall on that side of the spectrum. So this is what I call some cognitive dissonance. We're going to talk about why I think this view about when the soul enters is problematic and how I respond to this. But this is the kind of viewpoint.
Okay.
So we'll keep watching. So this is now another big theological point that I talked about earlier, which is that they want to prohibit women from getting abortions if it's done for financial reasons. The reason is that there are Quranic verses that condemn female infanticide for fear of poverty.
Okay.
So what the Quran responds back, it says that don't fear poverty. God is the one who provides sustenance for you, and put your trust in God. So it's a theological belief that your risk, or the amount of sustenance that you have throughout life, how much money, how much wealth you're going to have, how much food you're going to have, that this is ultimately provided by God. So that's don't fear poverty and kill your female infant based out of that. Now, I agree with this viewpoint, but I think what the Islamic traditionalist clerics are missing is the fact that the real reason why the Quran is saying this is because it's actually primarily valuing the human life and saying, don't kill the human life because God will protect, don't worry, God will provide you. So it's more that it's valuing human life than the secondary theological point that God will provide financial, don't worry about the poverty aspect. And the reason why I say that is because the Islamic tradition does take a more lenient view towards contraception, which I agree with. So I'm okay with contraception. And the reason is because at this point in time, life has not started. And therefore, you can, if you're not ready to have a child, you can, at this point in time, decide to use contraception. At that time, in the early Islamic period, it was just coitus interruptus that you would use, natural method, basically.
Right.
That's why I think there's a confusion. It's a misfiring that, yes, the fear of poverty is never considered an excuse, but the primary reason that it's not is because you shouldn't take a life for the fear of poverty. So that's what I wanted to make that intervention. And then you also see that here, the Islamic traditionalist leaders are actually showing the link between female infanticide and abortion, because the prohibition of the fear of poverty was actually stated in relation to female infanticide, right? So now you see that in the Islamic conception, the two are linked together, contrary to what the popular discourse amongst American Muslims has become. And Sheikh Hamza Yusuf's article does mention this clearly. He says that infanticide was discussed historically in the pre-modern period along with abortion. That's the intervention I wanted to make here.
Interesting.
Okay. So, like I said, before 40 days, they're pretty lenient. Now,
Right.
in their verbiage, though, they will try to make it sound like they're not lenient. And
Yeah.
even in this video, it makes it sound like it's very stringent reasons. But we're going to see in other material that we're going to look at, it's actually not very stringent. So one of the reasons that they give that's acceptable for aborting before 40 days is simply that the mother is not ready to raise children, another child at this point in time. She might, for example, if she has a 1-year-old, she may not want a second child at this point in time.
Right.
This is considered a legitimate reason to abort the baby before 40 days.
Hmm.
So you can see why I'm a little bit critical of this viewpoint as someone
Right.
who's pro-life.
Yeah, that's not what the slide says.
It's not what the slide says. And we'll see that if you actually watch Imam Suleiman's video clip, you'll actually see some of the verbiage slippage that I call it, where he will raise these other reasons. So it's this, I think this slide is a little bit misleading.
Yeah.
Okay, this slide is problematic because already it's saying that after 120 days, you can still abort for rape. So what if, and we're going to talk about rape. Rape is the most sensitive topic. I don't want to be blasé about that.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later. But what if the mother, what if she's 9 months pregnant? Then would you still say that it's okay to abort because the mother was raped? I think not many Muslims would be comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And then as far as extreme fetal deformity, incompatible with life, I think this is another bad reason that's often given. I think based on the Islamic worldview, if God decrees that a child should not live past a certain age, then we allow the child to live until that certain age. If the child is going to die right at birth, then we wait for that to happen, right?
Yeah.
We don't force it ourselves, because oftentimes this determination can be incorrect. How often does it happen that a doctor says that the patient is dead and they come back to life, right? Or they live longer? And I say come back to life because I've had that experience as an ER doctor. And this is on the other end of life, where I'm also against active euthanasia. And even I would say that, that's another topic altogether, but I'm also pro-life when it comes to that aspect.
Yeah.
But it has happened to me that I have pronounced someone dead and brought the family in, and then the patient came back to life.
Wow.
Why is that? Because I was using criteria like brain death and other conceptions that Muslims have also accepted, by the way. So the same Imam Umar Suleiman, I believe, has agreed, and it's not his fault. I mean, he's quoting like the big juridical councils, which have also signed on to the idea of brain death. So Muslims have signed on to this idea of brain death, whereas I am an Islamic bioethicist who's arguing that this is based on bad science. And even Harvard Medical School is the one who started this idea of brain death. Now see what they're saying. Dr. Trugg has said that it's based on bad science, even though he still believes we should use the same criteria for organ transplantation. But he's saying that we should just admit that the person is not dead.
Wow.
So it's the same concept that what happens is at the end of life, what they do is they again turn to the idea of a non-person human. So at the beginning of life, you have a non-person human, which is the fetus. And then at the end of life, once you become a useless husk that you're not beneficial to society, you become a non-person human again. And as an ER doc, I'm very concerned about this because, by the way, once you become DNR, DNI, like do not resuscitate, physicians and nurses treat you differently when you come to the hospital. That's a reality. And there's a term that we use in ER. It's called Gomer. It's a slang term, which means get out of my ER. It goes down to Gomer. And a Gomer is pretty much any old, crippled, debilitated person that's hard to look at. That's what a Gomer is. So what we have done in society now, what Western world is moving towards, it's moving away from the sanctity of life that's part of the Jewish and Christian heritage, and moving towards this kind of utilitarian view of life, where now this Gomer that I'm seeing is no longer a worthwhile citizen. And so we strip them of their personhood and now they're expendable at this point in time. And in certain European countries, it is the slippery slope where old people are being pushed in the direction of euthanasia. So the fears that people had of euthanasia, I think as a medical ethicist, I'm telling you that they are valid fears and we will go in that direction. So that's why I'm very concerned about this idea of 40 days or 120 days. And we'll talk about this a little bit more.
Okay.
Okay, so there are a few points here. Number one is that I'm also disturbed by this statement, which is that it's a case-by-case basis and that you should find an Islamic expert who can guide you in your unique situation. This is essentially a pro-choice position, that it's a case-by-case basis. And I think it arrogates too much control to an Islamic cleric. So I am a modernist, and in this sense, I am critical of the clerical establishment, not all of them, but I think this arrogates to them life and death, and I don't think we should do that. So that's another point there.
Yeah.
So that is that first volley there. This is the infographic that you can see from the same site, where basically you see that they're talking about a pre-soul period and then a post-soul. So there's this idea of ensoulment. So I think we should talk about that, which is based on a hadith. So in Islam, there are two primary sources, scriptural sources. One is the Quran, that's the central primary text. And the second is the Sunnah, which is the prophetic tradition. And it's encapsulated by what's called the hadith, which is the textual reports of that Sunnah. So there's two things, basically. There's Quran and there's hadith. Now, this is also a difference of opinion amongst traditionalists and modernists. So as a modernist, I am part of the hadith skeptical camp. And as a Western academic, by the way, as an academic scholar of religion, of Islamic studies, of Quranic studies, I believe that the hadith is a product of a later period and that it was back projected onto the Prophet. I don't completely reject hadith. I think it's valuable in the sense that it tells us the opinions of the early Muslims, which might reflect views that come from the Prophet, but I don't think it's a direct report from the Prophet, is what I'm trying to say. Now, traditionalists would take the hadith much more seriously. And in fact, in practice, they take the hadith over the Quran because the hadith specifies the Quran. But the point is that it's only in the hadith, really, that we get this idea of when the soul enters into the fetus. And what I would say there, even if you're a traditionalist, and here's where I refer you back to Sheikh Hamza's article, because he deals with this issue himself. He says, basically, if I remember correctly, that look, there's a difference of opinion even amongst Islamic scholars because the text in the hadith are not clear. There's contradictory reports, and also the same report can be interpreted in two different ways. The same report can be interpreted as 40 days and 120 days.
That's not good.
So that's not good, and you shouldn't base life and death based on a difference. So as a modernist and a Western scholar, I would say that, look, this is already a suspect source. But even if you're going to use it, it's so ambiguous and doubtful that you shouldn't rely on it. Furthermore, the idea of the soul is in the Quran itself. God says that, or the Quran says that the Prophet should say, when people ask him about the soul, he should say, this is a mystery of God. That we don't know much about what the human soul is. And so we really don't know when the soul enters the human fetus. So therefore, I believe, going back to my earlier view, that we should not, and the main point I come to is that this idea of the soul is intended to ennoble the human and to make their life more sacrosanct. So it's a morbid irony that we are now using the idea of the soul to take away human life. That's actually completely backward. So the idea of the soul should make you want to protect human life, not used to justify abortion, killing human life. So that's kind of the direction that I go. Do you have any questions on this? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know you're great. I mean, I don't have any. I'm not having to do any work here. This is so interesting. No, my one question about that was: do you have a sense of where the days 40 and 120 originally came from? Like, why these very even numbers?
Because it's in a hadith report.
Okay, got it.
And the words that are used are thumma, which means then, but it can also be interpreted as concurrently. So if you take the concurrent explanation, it's like kind of like, you've probably seen different accounts of how God created the universe.
Yes.
You can interpret it in different ways.
Yes.
Similarly, it's the same kind of thing with the descriptions of the human, the embryo.
Okay.
You can take it either being concurrently, or you can take it as not concurrently or successive. If you take the successive interpretation, which is probably more intuitive, by the way, then you would get to 120 days. But then you would pretty much be outside. I would say if you take the 120 days view, then you're outside of the pro-choice camp, I would say.
Right.
So if you take the view that the soul enters at 40 days, then I think you're out of the pro-choice camp. You're practically speaking, because most
you're drawing
abortions,
the line too early for them.
You're drawing the line too early. Okay, and if that's when the soul enters, then you wouldn't want. You'd actually say the presumption is that we want to save life, and that therefore it should be illegal, because otherwise you're killing human beings. Let's keep going, and it'll become more and more clear. All right. So here's the article by Omar Suleiman. So I want you to check that out. But there's a key point in here that I want you to be cognizant of, which is that even though Imam Umar wants to portray himself as neither pro-choice or pro-life, if you actually read the article, I think it's clear that this is going to be utilized in a way of being pro-choice. So the bottom line is that when you get to the bottom of this article, or the meat of the article, I guess, you see this key quote. According to the scholar that he relies upon, abortion in the first 40 days of pregnancy upon the mutual agreement of both parents is permissible for a legitimate cause, such as the woman's fear of not having the capacity to raise a newborn. So remember, this is the same website that made that infographic.
Wow. That
infographic tried to make, the video made it look like it's very stringent reasons, but I don't know, Josh, do you think this is very stringent?
I mean, I don't know how anyone would call that stringent. I mean, that's one of those kind of, classic loopholes so big you could drive a Mack truck through kind of a thing.
I mean, it's like saying you can steal something. You shouldn't steal something for no reason, but if you're in need, then if you need that thing, then you can steal it.
Right.
It's almost circular, almost.
Right. Almost.
And then, and basically then it's just about preferential, that it's better to avoid that. Right. But really, so I think this view is going to be used for the pro-choice view. And I think the article that I quoted to you earlier, where a Muslim woman does take this viewpoint in that pro-choice direction. And even it's up to 120 days. So the pressing reason is up to 120 days. And we'll see that it's not that rigid, even to 120 days. Now we're going to look at another Islamic cleric. He's more on what I would say the fundamentalist puritanical side. He is from the Salafi or Wahhabi movement kind of thing. And we're going to see what he says. And we're going to show you that even a major Salafi Wahhabi scholar is actually pro-choice in some ways. Maybe that's a little bit of a stretch, but
we'll see.
She said, my husband wants me to get an abortion because his family has a history of medical problems. What is the Islamic ruling? I say, and Allah knows best. That there is a general consensus among the scholars that once the fetus is breathed the soul into him, that is accomplished after 4 months and 10 days. As it is stated in the hadith, which is narrated by Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, may Allah be pleased with him. The different stages before breathing the soul into the fetus is 3. Each stage consists of 40 days. Nutfa, alaqah, mudghah, etc. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends the angel who's in charge of the womb to breathe the soul into the fetus. So after that stage, after 4 months and 10 days, in the 5th month, it is agreed upon the prohibition of abortion amongst all the scholars of Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, except in one case that will make it permissible to abort the baby if the pregnancy poses a life threat to the mother. So if the physicians are certain that this kind of pregnancy will terminate the life of the mother, then it is permissible to abort the baby.
So 2 points. One is 4 months is the view, right?
Right.
That's that's pro-choice.
I read the 120-day view.
Yeah, 120 days. The vast majority of abortions take place before that. And the second point is that I should address that Imam Umar also mentioned. He said in the video, we didn't play it, but there's another video interview with him. Mm-hmm. He said that Catholics, unlike Catholics, Muslims prioritize the woman's life over the fetus in case one needs to be saved. I might be wrong, but I believe this is misrepresenting the Catholic viewpoints. I don't know what you think about that, Josh. Is that because my understanding?
I think that's a misrepresentation. I mean, when life of the mother comes up with Catholics, like typically we're almost always talking about a tubal pregnancy. Mm-hmm. And the United States Council of Catholic Bishops has actually been really clear. Like they have functionally the same position that I have outside of one really small area. They're very, very, but so basically they would agree that if a woman has a pregnancy that is going to kill her, like in a tubal pregnancy, then a medical intervention can be done. Now, they will not call it an abortion. They will call it a life-saving medical procedure to save a woman's life. But they would use what's called double effect reasoning to say this is a morally justifiable but tragic decision that has to be made. The only distinction between their view and some other pro-life philosophers is that the medical procedure they say is okay to do is they're choosing the least direct method of harming the baby, called a self-injectomy. And some other pro-life people would say there's not a big enough moral difference between that and two other more direct approaches. But like pro-lifers don't, there are almost no pro-life people, Catholic, Christian, or otherwise, that are saying that women should have to commit suicide via pregnancy. That's just not our view.
So that's my understanding as well. And I think the double effect makes a lot of sense. And this is clear philosophical reasoning that the Catholics are engaging in. And I think that, unfortunately, our Muslim thinkers have not really thought this through as rigorously. And that's what I'm trying to get us to do. And I think the reason is, and I'm saying this as somebody who's leaning in this modernist direction, is modernists in general have argued that we need to move away from a law paradigm and move towards a moral philosophical or moral theology paradigm. So, and that makes you more consistent across the board, as opposed to when you're looking for, basically what you're looking for is like snippets of text that you can then construct this legal haphazard kind of ruling, which is what you're going to see in some of these videos. I think you're going to see is that they're going to be very inconsistent. So is it 40 days? Is it 120 days? Well, if it's 40 days, then why are you allowing it after 40 days? Because, and why does the reason that you come up with, why does that make any difference? Right. So that's a key point to make, that, okay, if you're saying that it's a soul, then the reason that you abort it, as far as like electively, should not matter. So for example, if I fear, why is it that if I fear poverty, it's not allowed, but if I just not ready to have a kid, it is allowed? So does it suddenly become a life in the first situation and not a life in the second situation? And this is also something that pro-choice people do a lot, which is they think that what we think in our minds, it's social constructivism. So it's like, it's only a life if I think it's a life. So if you have a pregnant lady, she's 4 months pregnant. If she wants to have that kid, then it's okay to say it's a baby. It's okay to say that it's, talk about it like it's a life. And then it's wrong for anyone to harm her and try to kill that life. It's wrong. It would be, in their minds, even murder maybe. Maybe they'd kind of catch themselves and say it's not murder. But if the woman doesn't want to have the baby, then suddenly it's not a baby, it's not a life. But whether or not what you think is the case, that doesn't change what is the case. It's either alive or it's not alive. And the way we can know this is like another argument is like viability. So this is a common argument I get, which I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think very rigorous philosophers who are pro-choice, I don't think they ever use the viability.
No, this is like the worst personhood definition ever. It's a moving target.
It's exactly. So that's what I had this discussion with a colleague of mine, and he said viability. Yeah. Well, I told him 100 years ago, medical technology was different. So are you telling me that life began much later then or earlier then? One of the two, right? It would be a moving target. As technology gets better, we can...
Does that mean that younger babies are now persons just because our technology is better?
Exactly. And also, if you look at viability, you can look at graphs. At certain weeks, like 22, 23 weeks, I believe, if the baby is delivered at that time, the baby has a 50% chance of success, of viability. So are you telling me that the child at that moment in time that it's born, is it alive or is it not alive? If it's based on viability, it's a 50% alive and 50% dead, which doesn't make a lot of sense.
Or are they making a threshold argument where once you're past 49%, you're alive, but that just seems really metaphysically weird.
Especially with the technology changing.
Right.
Right. And then would you be alive in a village in India where they don't have that technology?
Right.
Or if you're in Brigham and Women's in Massachusetts?
What if you're that pregnant and you take a transatlantic flight to India? At what point is this baby no longer alive? Like it just falls apart.
If you're 50% of the way there, that's what it is, right? Yeah. So, I think viability arguments don't work. And what I'm arguing here is that even though I'm sympathetic to the fact that traditionalists want to be pro-life, I think their actual reasoning is not sophisticated and it's not consistent. And that's because they're relying on this kind of textual legalism as opposed to this moral philosophical viewpoint. And that's why I am kind of like I'm almost like a Christianophile in a way, in the sense that I believe that Muslims should move in the direction of Christian philosophy. And that's kind of what I'm arguing for. So
really interesting.
Let's keep watching.
But if they find out, for instance, after 5 or 6 months that the baby is deformed, this is not a legitimate reason to abort the baby because he's become a living human being. Yes, it's still in the womb, but it has its rights and honor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. We've indeed honored the children of Adam.
Okay.
So we must respect this human soul.
So I think that one is enough of listening to it. Basically, you're seeing how on the one side, they're being like, we value human life and we're pro-life. But in the other, they're allowing this huge, the door of abortion. Right. So I think that's interesting. This is another really conservative. This is a 3-minute clip. I hope you don't mind that I'm...
No, this is good.
Okay.
And I have a question for the Sheikh.
Okay.
It's regarding my friend. She's pregnant and she's thinking to terminate the pregnancy because she still has a small child and financially they are not ready.
Okay.
So when I told her it's haram, she told me it's not yet haram, provided it's less than 40 days. So I'm confused, and I told her, how would you know the exact date of the fetus is high? If you are thinking to high.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khair. Sister Laila there from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Sister Laila has a friend who's pregnant. She wants to terminate the pregnancy because she says she still has a small child and she feels that they are still financially incapable. She also said that when she told her that she shouldn't do this, she said that someone gave her the permission and told her that once it's less than 40 days, it's okay to terminate or abort the fetus.
Well, the Prophet told us, alayhi salatu wassalam, about the stages where the fetus undergoes. And we know for sure that after the first 120th day, the soul or the spirit would have been blown into or would have been breathed into the fetus.
Yes.
So it is definitely a soul that cannot be killed. From the day 80, to days 120, this is the stage where the fetus is given its form, meaning that it would be given the hands, the arms, the head, and the legs. Some scholars said that before 40 days, it's just a sperm and an egg. So it is not still a fetus, an embryo. And some scholars said that this is like anything else. So if a woman wants to abort the pregnancy, she is allowed to do this. The majority of scholars say that she is not allowed to do this unless there's a legitimate reason. And fearing the provisions or the loss of provision, fearing that money would run low, is a breach of trust in Allah. Because any Muslim believes that it is not his own doing that brings the money and puts the food on the table. It is Allah's support and blessing upon us. Therefore, to take out the trust in Allah and say, well, I believe in that, but I want to take matters into my own hands and depend entirely on myself, and not to believe in the Quran where Allah tells us that it is He who provides us and our children. This would be a breach of trust in Allah the Almighty. And the reason that the sister wants to abort the pregnancy is not legitimate, therefore it is not permissible.
Okay, Jazakallah khair.
Okay, so lots of things there. Number one is that now you got another timestamp.
80.
Pick up with it. 80 days.
Yes.
Okay.
So it was like, where did 80 come from?
So now we have 40 days, we have 80 days, and we have 120 days. Okay. And it doesn't jive with scientific reality, right?
Yeah.
With fact, because we now have we have ultrasound evidence that contradicts these ideas that he said. So all of his things were factually just incorrect, right?
Yeah.
So before 40 days, it's not like a sperm and an egg. It's not, as a lot of liberal Muslims and pro-choice people will say, it's not just a clump of cells.
Right.
That is just something that you say to make your argument and feel better. But in reality, it's anything but a clump of cells. If you were a scientist, you'd be like, wow, what is this thing that's doing these things? It's a whole organism, and it meets the criteria of life. If you were studying any other creature other than human beings, you would say that it's alive and it's part of that species. So if you were studying dogs as a scientist, you would say that that's a life. That's not just like a fingernail or anything like that. It's only when we come to the human being that suddenly we're saying, well, we're not sure if it's fully human. And really what this is the distinction we were talking about earlier between human being and personhood. So that's really what's going on if they were actually trying to be consistent. But now I would strongly recommend people to look at the scientific evidence, the medical evidence that shows when brain activity takes place, when the organs are already in place, and what the baby looks like. You can just take a look at the ultrasound and you'll be like, I looked at my baby's first ultrasound and I was like, oh no, that's a human being. And my wife, who's pro-choice, I was like, tell me that's not a human being. And she was like, stop it, I'm against it for myself. And we got into that whole thing.
Don't ask me questions that make
Don't
me
ask me
uncomfortable.
questions. Yes, exactly. So, and she's okay with that. She hates the debating with me. So, that's what I would say there. But again, you have this 40 days, 80 days, 120 days. It's just not consistent. Any questions on that so far?
No, I mean, obviously there are so many things I would have wanted to say to the two gentlemen, but we're now here. So
okay.
I think you said it well.
Okay. Next, I wanted to show you what a Deobandi scholar says. Deoband is the largest kind of Islamic movement, kind of trend of Islamic thought in South Asia. So it's right next to Al-Azhar as far as its prestige amongst traditionalist scholars. They're very conservative. So this is what even conservative traditionalists like Deoband would say. And basically, it's the exact same thing, which is that they give the 40 and 120 days. And really, they go to the 120-day mark. Hanafis do, at least, which is the biggest school of Islamic thought. They go all the way to 120 days. So they do give reasons why they think it's. And what's interesting is what the conservatives do is they pretty much rule out the reasons that a woman would want to get an abortion, but they leave other reasons. But even they use like this mother's mental well-being. I mean, that's
what does that mean?
What does that mean? I mean, all of those percent in that poll, they would say it would be my mental well-being that would be affected, right? I'm not ready to have children yet.
Right.
This is a Salafi or very popular Salafi Wahhabi, very conservative puritanical website. Even they, what is the ruling on aborting a pregnancy in the early months before the soul is breathed into the fetus? Look, they always state initially that it's as if they're pro-life, right? But then you look at this huge gap where a truck could go into, a legitimate reason within very precise limits. All right. Within 40 days, again, they say the first stage, a legitimate purpose that will ward off harm, then it is permissible to abort it. Now they do ban this kind of for fear of difficulty of raising children. They do make that not permissible. So that's the difference.
That's
that you
consistently said very specifically. Here's like one reason you definitely can't have an abortion. And a lot of the others seems like it's a lot more all over the place.
So the consistent one is the financial reason. That's because the Quran is very clear about that.
Right.
The one that differs between conservative and more liberal, open-minded scholars is the fear of raising multiple children, because the less conservative scholars are more sympathetic to the woman's needs, whereas the more conservative ones are simply not. So that is, and you just read the rest of this. It's actually pretty lenient, which is interesting. Now I wanted to look at a very fun figure. I like him a lot. His name is Mufti Abu Layth. He is what I call a bad boy Molvi, which means he actually trained as a traditional Islamic scholar. He's a mufti. He doesn't look like a mufti, but he is a mufti.
Can you define that for white guy over here?
Yeah, so it's like a rigorous 7-year kind of program that you do. The mufti course is like the additional 2 years that you do, but all in all, you're talking about almost a decade of training in the traditional Islamic sciences. Wow. And so he's a credentialed scholar from that standpoint, but he has turned kind of liberal. And so he kind of has earned the ire of the entire traditionalist community. And he's super popular. He's fun. He keeps it light. I like him a lot. He has some very helpful viewpoints. So he's going to actually take the most pro-choice stand.
Interesting.
And even though I like him a lot, I'm going to say that his arguing here is not very rigorous, philosophically speaking. And I do want to engage with him on that. And then I'm sure we'll talk on WhatsApp with him afterward.
Okay.
All right.
What is Islam's view on abortion? Philip Hesse, ¿qué está pasando, Hesse? ¿Qué está pasando? What's going down? Philip, I don't know if Hesse is Spanish, by the way. I'm just blagging that it is. But what does Islam have to say about abortion? What does Islam have to say about abortion? What do we think Islam has to say about abortion? Let's have a democratic approach. Let's vote. No, right, okay. Abortion, I believe abortion is permissible. So just to sum it up, it is permissible. Now, and I don't believe people need to be micromanaged. So some people will say to me, yes, it's permissible under this, give the caveat, give the caveats out there that this is the condition to make it permissible. I'm saying, yes, those conditions are commonsensical. Nobody takes an abortion or undergoes an abortion for a joke. So there's no need really trying to micromanage people in saying, well, oh, but have you really thought about it? Well, what do you think a person? Nobody just gets up and says, well, what shall I do today? I haven't got much on. I know I'll just get an abortion. I mean, it doesn't work like that. So whoever is undertaking an abortion is obviously undertaking it because they've thought it through. that it's going to be, there's going to be certain problems, whatever the problems are, but they've thought it through.
Oh, clearly be no problem.
I'm not in the game of trying to micromanage people, and I don't believe Islam is interested in micromanaging people. The clergy often are trying to micromanage people because it's an attempt to exercise power over people. So it's permissible. Now I'll go into what the ulama of the past had said.
Okay, so some key points there, because these are common arguments. These are actually more along the lines of what liberal Muslims would say, liberal and progressive Muslims. Okay. So the first is micromanagement. Really, this is the viewpoint that I hear the most, which is I personally would be opposed to abortion. This is the most common answer I get from American Muslims, which is I personally would not get an abortion, but I would not want to force my viewpoint on another person.
You know what's interesting about that? That's actually the most common thing we hear from any American on a college campus.
Interesting.
It's not just like we literally just call that the standard pro-choice position at this point. It's like we hear it more often than any other single statement during our outreaches.
And I think it's because, and I don't know what you think on this, it's perhaps because morally, intuitively, they know that there's something wrong with abortion, so they want to distance themselves from it, but then they don't want to force it on another person.
That feels mean.
That feels mean. And I do think liberals, the liberal philosophy is the idea that you don't force your views on others and that kind of thing. So even I agree with some of that. But the issue is that when it comes to life, that is the only place, really, one of the only places, your wealth is another one, but that's where the state has an interest in protecting you and your life. So that is where the state does intervene. And the reason why this is a poor argument is, what about female infanticide? Would you also say that, look, I don't want to judge for a woman whether or not she can, kill her newborn baby, because that's what people could have said in the time of the Prophet. When the Quran came and said that don't do this female infanticide, they could say, okay, I'm opposed to it, but I don't know the circumstances, because those people are pretty in rough circumstances. They're not doing it lightly. And really what he's also said then is that another common argument that I hear, which is that most women who get abortions have thought about it thoroughly, and they've taken their own life circumstances into mind and then reached the decision to get an abortion. Now, I do think in the vast majority of cases, it is correct to say that it's not a light decision that people make. However, 2 points are to keep in mind. One is that there are people who do believe, because they're so pro-choice, that they do believe that there's no big deal in getting an abortion because it's not a life. And there was even a story of a student, I believe, who used to do abortions and then use the fetal body parts as as jewelry and stuff. Now, that's obviously a fringe element, but there's another bigger point, which is the fact that those individuals, when they're engaging in that moral reasoning process, they're tapping into their society, and that whatever their society is telling them informs their decision-making process. So if that same society had told that person that, no, this is a morally egregious act, that would weigh on the person's moral thinking. And if the society provided strong moral reasons why it's morally egregious, that would also come to play. But what we see today is really, because the pro-choice lobby is so strong and it's like anathematized the idea that you could be pro-life, people don't even know the pro-life arguments. And so they don't even do the moral reasoning. So I'm even arguing right now as a Muslim, I'm not even saying that let's go force this down and shove this down. We're not even anywhere near that stage.
Right.
Really, what I'm saying is that at least let's open up the space where we can argue why I would be, at least on a theoretical level, pro-life.
Right.
And that will even have an effect, even if the law doesn't change.
Right.
But if I'm at least allowed to have that discourse, at least individual people. So again, his idea that micromanagement, well, the state, that's what the state does. We micromanage life and harm. So if a woman is raped, it's not the state that's intervening to micromanage sex. No, it's the state intervening to prevent a woman from being harmed. Similarly, the state intervenes when a baby is involved. If you neglect a baby, the Child Protection Services is going to come and take that baby away from you. Is that micromanagement? No, that's protection of life.
Yeah.
I agree with him on his criticisms of the clergy, because as a modernist, of course, I agree with that. But we will have to at some point in time deal with the idea that this is exerting power over a woman's body. So I do think at some point in time, maybe if he mentions it, we'll have to talk about women's autonomy arguments, because this is what an average Muslim liberal will raise.
Yeah.
And you saw that in kind of the tweet.
So the ulama of the past, when discussing matters of abortion, and this, when I'm saying past now, I'm talking up to 1,000 years ago.
So ulama is the Islamic scholars.
Okay.
Some prior to that. Okay. So we're talking a very long time ago. So keep that in mind, people, because it's important. Why is it important? Because you have to remember, how was abortion performed in that day and age? That's an important point to keep in mind, because these things were often life-threatening. I mean, they can still be today in certain, but often there's a lot of safety nets present today. So a person, it's not usually, inshallah, it's not usually for most people who are stuck in such difficult predicaments, it's not life-threatening. Right, so everybody agrees that even though we do accept that there is life there, I'm not saying, people will try and say that, do you not recognize there is life? There is life, but then life is a spectrum. See, plants are alive. That's life. Animals are alive. That's life. Humans and fetus. A fetus is not, in my understanding, the same as an actual human being. It is in the process of becoming a human being. People may disagree with me. That's fine, but that's my perspective. I feel that a fetus is in the developmental stages of becoming a human being. So it has not yet reached that state. Now, if it was terminated en route, that sounds a bit lethal.
It is lethal.
Well, yeah, abortion is very lethal.
I am, the Terminator from the future. I'll be back. Right. So I don't mean it but if it was aborted for some reason, then I don't feel it's the same as saying, oh, it's okay to murder someone. To me, that's a dumb analogy. To me, that's a dumb analogy, okay? To some people, it may make sense. They may say, yeah, that's just the same as getting a 3-year-old child and murdering a 3-year-old child. And I'll think like, I don't know what you're smoking, mate. But I think either you can pass it around and everybody can smoke it, and then we can be on the same level. No, so to me, these things are permissible, and people can't. And I know Americans especially
Okay, so that's the part that I really wanted. So sorry for playing that whole thing. That was
go ahead.
That was the part that I really wanted to
Please respond before
on.
I do. Go ahead.
So again, I don't want to say any disrespect to any of the figures that I am, engaging with. Mufti Abu Layth has taken some very brave positions, and I do appreciate his jovial attitude. Sometimes I think it can be a little bit excessive and can detract from the argument. But sometimes it's also important to keep in mind that people use laughing and jokes as a substitute for argumentation. I don't think that's a good idea, but I understand that that's what people are doing. I've noticed this with anti-theists a lot, actually. They, like Christopher Hitchens, he would do this. If he didn't have a strong philosophical argument, so he would just throw in the zinger, the crowd would, hurrah.
They loved it.
And they loved it. And people thought, oh, that's the end of it. But really, it's because he didn't have the philosophical rigor. So I think in this specific case, my criticism is just with this specific argument. Yes, I would say that Mufti Abu Layth's argument is not philosophically rigorous. And the reason is he's now come to the even more troubling viewpoint that life comes in gradations, so that a fetus is not as human and not as alive as a 3-year-old. Well, then is a 3-year-old less alive than a 25-year-old? If you look at the arguments that he raised, that it's still in the time of progression and still becoming fully human, well, that doesn't happen until you're 25 years of age, right? In some ways. So are we saying that a 3-year-old is not as human and alive? If we're, again, on that sinking Titanic, are we now going to throw out the 3-year-old to save the 25-year-old? Are we? And why take a 3-year-old? Take a newborn baby. Take a 1-year-old. are you telling me that a newborn is born, it's like pretty much blind at birth? It can't do anything by itself.
Right.
It will die if you leave it for even a day or so, it will die. It's not the same as a 15-year-old, a 3-year-old,
right.
a 25-year-old, a 60-year-old. And should we then say when your grandpa becomes demented and an invalid, that now grandpa is also less of a human being? This is precisely that social constructivist view that I'm critical of, and that I'm saying that, no, we need to draw the line in the sand, that you're a human being, you are alive. That's all that matters. Yeah. Now, what people will keep coming back to is, but they're not born yet. But that is circular logic. You have to justify why you're drawing the line at birth. And that, what we talked about in the previous episode, is very difficult to do because it's very hard to see the difference between a newborn that's 1 minute old and a fetus that's 1 minute before delivery, right? It's very hard to see what the difference would be in any meaningful way. Yeah. So, Josh, do you have anything to add on? Because I mean,
I'll say one thing. I mean, there are a lot of things, but just one. I mean, I really agree with what you said, where people can sometimes use laughter and jokes, and in this case, mocking, just kind of mocking the other side as opposed to making an argument. And it's too bad because in this case, you know, he started an argument. He started to make an argument by saying, well, it seems like clearly plants are one level of life and animals are another level of life, and then fetuses are another level of life, and then you have human beings. And if he had a good reason for thinking that the unborn are at this different level of life and kind of defining what that means, like this is life and death, like let's be really careful here. If you're right, like let's really know where to draw that line. Right when he should have done that is when he said, if you disagree with me, you must be smoking something and I would love to try that. Like that's, you haven't finished your argument, man. Like I'm open to the argument, but it didn't happen. He kind of just basically made this circular, just kind of like a asserting, question begging kind of an argument. And that's just, it's not the kind of work that you're doing. And I'm really glad that you're doing the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. And just to come to Mufti Abu Layth's defense, I would say that unlike other people who do that joking thing, he usually does it to lighten the mood and not in reality to put other people down. So even though I get it, it can come across that way. I just know him very well that he just does it to lighten the mood and joke with people. So,
but he's just not going to be persuasive to someone who disagrees because he hasn't completed an argument. And that's what he would need to do if he wants to change people's minds.
Right. And I think really it's just intuition based on social kind of norms that's what's really the source of his thinking. So he's just taking it as assumed that, so it's all question begging is what it is. So, so that's one. That was a really powerful one that I wanted to show you. We're almost done. So this is another pro-choice. I would say this is Dr. Shabir Ali. This is another video. I don't think we need to play it. It's the same kind of thing again. Okay. He's also a scholar that I really respect, that I really like, very open-minded. But again, I don't think it's philosophically rigorous. I don't think it's really their fault. I think it's that Muslim thinkers and even bioethicists have not been rigorous in their thinking. And almost it's been the case that I feel like non-Muslim experts have been a little bit gloves off because they don't want to intrude into Muslim discourse. And so that's kind of the intervention that I'm trying to make. So let's see. This is a scholar that I really respect. I mean, he literally, his name is Mr. Javed Ahmad Ghamdi. He fled Pakistan because they killed the people, groups linked to the Taliban. They killed some of his people and horrible. They were threatening his family and colleagues. And so he had to flee Pakistan. So he works in exile. But he also takes, now, how's your Urdu, Josh? Is it pretty good?
Not at all.
I'm just joking. So this clip is in Urdu. But the key point here is that he uses the term shakhsiyat, which means like personality is what I get from a personhood. Okay. So he also makes the distinction between, so he says that before the soul is, blown into the fetus, yes, it's a human being, but it's still an animal, haywan, basically. Okay. That's the Arabic or Urdu term. Actually, it's also from Arabic. But then after the soul is blown into it, then it becomes a person. And I think the word he uses, shakhsiyat, that's
Okay.
the word he used. So you see that this discourse is being mirrored in another language. So I found that kind of interesting. So I disagree with this view as well, even though I deeply respect this scholar. And then final one that I wanted to show you is just, this is from a professor, Professor Khalil Muhammad of San Diego State University. And you'll notice at the top, the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice. So his thinking is a little bit actually better in some points, but he kind of makes the same arguments. And one of the arguments that he makes and some other people make, which I think is very troubling, is that we selectively use, and many reformists and modernists do this, is that they selectively use previous scholars of the past to justify their own view now, which I think is fine to do as like to give support to an argument, but your argument shouldn't rest on that. And it shouldn't rest on a hadith or a textual report unless you're a traditionalist who thinks that that's equivalent to the Quran. But if, from a methodological standpoint like me, you don't put it on that level, then you shouldn't use that to hang your hat on. And that's inconsistent amongst liberals and modernists to do that. And that's what I'm critical of here. But basically, he rests his hat on that. And then he also rests his hat on, I believe, I have to look at this, that the medieval Islamic scholars, first of all, in terms of inheritance, as well as in tort law, which is if somebody injures you, if a woman is injured and miscarries, the amount, the financial restitution that is due is not equal to a full human being.
Right.
So this argument is now being retooled to say that, look, even back then, they recognized that it's not a full human being.
Right.
What I would argue in response is that this is a very inconsistent argument to use as a liberal thinker. So the reason why I came to this view on sanctity of life, it has to do with the topic of jihad and my reading of jihad in the Quran, which is all based on the idea of raising the idea of sanctity of life as the utmost first principle. And what you see in the Quran is that it moves from the pre-Islamic Arabian idea of not only lineage and tribal thing that were like, if you're from one tribe, you're superior to another tribe, but also the idea that a free person is worth more than a slave, a man worth more than a woman. Yeah. So the Quran then moves to, it endorsed that view initially, and then it moves toward the view of a life for a life, that each life is equal to another life. So if you're going to raise this argument, then you're also going to have to say that you take their view, the medieval scholars. I mean, they lived in a different time. We can't be too harsh with them, but you have to take the view that a woman is inferior, is half the value of a man, that a slave is not equal to a free person. So you're going to have a hierarchy like that.
Right.
I'm saying we're moving past that. We're going towards a human exceptionalist viewpoint where all human beings are equal, whether they're a fetus, a newborn baby, a 3-year-old, a 30-year-old, a 300-year-old,
right,
however old you are.
Man or woman, gay or straight.
Man or woman, gay or straight, your moral worth is equal.
Yeah.
Whether you're black, you're white, anything, your moral worth is equal.
Yeah.
The last thing, Josh, I wanted to talk about is, we didn't talk about it and we have to, because most Muslim liberals are going to hang their hat on this, is the idea of bodily autonomy.
Yes.
So in your viewpoint, Josh, can you, because I've talked a lot and I'm fasting, so my voice is like fading.
Sure.
Can you tell the audience, if you don't mind, how common is this argument, and can you describe the argument?
Absolutely.
Well? Do you mind?
It's super common. And I've come to believe that for most, at least the pro-choice people that I've talked to, I think it is the most foundational part of their pro-choice view. Like pro-lifers tend to think of the main problem with pro-choice people is they don't understand that the fetus is a full human being or a person or something like that. And I think that's true of most pro-choice people. I just don't think it's the most important part of their view to them. To them, I think the most important part of their view is this idea, and there's a lot of different versions of it, but this idea that it would be a government oversight, or it would be I should say overreach for the government to say, this person, even if it is a person, they're sort of conceding for the sake of argument that it's a person, or else you don't even need this argument. But it's like, even if you're right that it's a person, it would be wrong for the government to say that you can't kill this person because it's in her body. And so they're just kind of like, it just changes the situation. And because we don't want to force, people to do things with anything even inside of their body, or have them be, sort of enslaved to anything inside of their body. In the end, we can't protect life if it's in someone else's body. I have a whole landing page if you're interested in learning about like a lot of our responses to bodily rights arguments. If you go to equalrightsinstitute.com/bodily rights, we have a whole landing page with videos and podcasts and articles and things like that on it. I'm super interested in kind of the things that you're going to say, but it is a hugely important part of the abortion discussion.
I agree, but I think you've been more charitable to the arguments than, because I think people have a jumble of thoughts in their mind. So I do think that, and I think you said that too, but that most of them don't consider the fetus, a human being. They consider it a clump of cells.
Yeah.
And then, but I agree with you that the overriding kind of motivation is a bodily rights argument, which is based in an idea of gender equality, women's rights, and this kind of thing. And this is the case with most liberal Muslims in America, for sure, which is, there's even, my body, my choice. In Urdu is often mera jism meri marzi. Meri jism meri marzi. Sometimes I mess up the
but does that functionally translate to my body, my choice?
Yes, it does. Okay. But you're fluent in Urdu, right? No. Okay. All right. So you got to brush up on that. All right.
That's why I brought you on, Jawad.
Now, the interesting thing is that it's actually not the Muslims, and this is a slogan that's being used in Pakistan, but it's actually being misapplied because it's not being used, or it's maybe being reappropriated. Maybe it's being used for clothing choice, not for abortion. However, I do see that in the West, I do think there is this idea of my body, my choice. And what I would say that this is a very weak argument for most Muslims, even liberal Muslims, because it's so easy to refute. Because unless you're willing to bite the bullet, which most of them are not, it's going to go to the wayside really quickly. So the argument in a nutshell is it's within my body as a woman, and you can't tell me what to do with my body, and therefore I can do what I want with it. Yeah. And well, then all you can ask is, what about an abortion, a late-term abortion?
Right.
An abortion at 9 months, one day before delivery. Now, they're going to quickly switch around here and say, why are you talking about that? Only 1% of abortions are done at 9 months of age. But that's not how you argue philosophically. Philosophical arguments are done where you take an argument and you try to use extreme cases to see if your argument holds or not. So I think it's an invalid kind of counter argument to that. That basically, if you're saying that the primary reason why you're pro-choice is that it's a woman's right, then that overrides in your viewpoint that it being a life, then that holds whether you're in the first month of pregnancy or the last month of pregnancy. And unless you're willing to bite that bullet,
right,
that argument does not work for you.
Right.
So you have to bite the bullet that up until delivery, abortion is legal and morally okay. So that's why I think that this argument doesn't work. The other reason is simple double standards. So most women agree that a man who conceives a child should have to pay child support for that child. But what if he doesn't consent to being a father? What if he wants an abortion, but the mother does not want an abortion? We still say that the father has to pay child support. Now, I realize that there is a potential argument that the other side can give, and I don't think it's the worst argument, which is that child support is a lesser imposition than using your body. I get that.
Sure.
I think it's debatable. I mean, you're up to 18 years of financial support. So, I think that's something that is even debatable. But the point is that we don't let choice alone decide whether something is alive or not. Otherwise, the father would have that choice. And the other thing is that Muslim leaders have often said that we are different than in the West because we say that decisions about abortion have to have mutual agreement between a man and the husband and the wife. Again, that's morally inconsistent, philosophically inconsistent. Why does it make a difference whether it's a life or not based on whether the father agrees or disagrees? That just doesn't make any sense. And likewise, whether the woman agrees or disagrees. And then the other argument that I think I heard on your podcast, which I thought was very effective, and I remembered from medical school reading about, is thalidomide.
Yeah.
Which is a medication that they used to use in morning sickness, but it ends up having severe teratogenic effects. So the fetus, the baby will be born deformed. I believe its limbs will be completely
deformed.
It'll
be born without arms and or legs if it survives the pregnancy.
So this is early pregnancy. It's still not a life if you think it's not a life, right? It's within the morning sickness happens in the first few weeks. So why couldn't a woman say it's my body, my choice? I'm the one suffering from morning sickness. None of the other medications are working, or I just prefer this medication. Why does it matter? I mean, would you allow a woman to have that choice? Now they're going to say, well, no reasonable woman would have. That's not the argument. This is a philosophical argument, right? We are trying to test your argument to see if it holds water. So you have to accept the hypothetical. So in that hypothetical, would you be okay? Would it be morally and legally permissible? Or should the state prevent her from giving thalidomide? And I believe the state should forbid a woman from using thalidomide because it will result in deformed children. Finally, the other argument that I could come up with is, I mean, this is kind of, it may not be a strong argument, but I do think it's something to think about, is what if you said, look, let's not put a woman through the pain and suffering of a surgical or medical abortion. Why don't we've already decided that this life is not worth keeping. Why don't we just wait till it's born and then get rid of it, so that the woman doesn't have to go through that torture of going through that procedure? What if you made that decision in those early weeks while it's still her decision?
So now, it seems like, aren't they just going to say that childbirth, though, is still a lot more painful than an abortion procedure?
But what if the woman decides that it's not for her? She doesn't want to see the body parts. She doesn't want to experience. It's just a philosophical question that I'm asking. So what if a woman decides that I don't want to keep this child, but I will wait till I've already decided it's not going to be a life, but just wait. It's my body. Just wait till afterward and then, or kill it right before it exits. I don't know if this is the strongest argument. We'd have to test it, but it did get me thinking.
So this has been really, really helpful and just so much information. I'm so grateful. And I know some of this I will throw in bonus stuff that people can listen to if they want to listen to the full thing. But let me just kind of ask you one question that I meant to ask you in our first episode, and we just kind of ran out of time. But you described, you went from pro-choice, you became pro-life, and you described, you sort of, process of eliminated yourself into the pro-life position because you're thinking through, well, self-awareness doesn't work, sentience doesn't work. You're like going through this project that you described, like a lot of people just don't do all of that and then end up changing their mind. But what I want to know, because what makes you very unique, or one thing that makes you unique, is the fact that you began that process at all. What is it that made you start actually questioning your pro-choice beliefs that resulted in you becoming pro-life? Because I think that is very, very interesting.
So the initial interest came about due to my research as a liberal reformist thinker. I started, my dissertation topic is on jihad in the Quran and how do we, basically the ethics of war and peace in Islam. And one of the things I came to was that sanctity of life is acknowledged in the Islamic tradition, but I think it needs to be bolstered. So we really need to look at the Quran for inspiration in this aspect. And so then when I started thinking about sanctity of life, then I had to think about it across the board and reassess. Actually, it was first with euthanasia that I started feeling less and less comfortable with. And then if I had to think about the end of life, then I had to start thinking of the beginning of life as well. And then I really I just came to the point where I said, I'm not going to worry about what anyone else thinks about what I say or believe. I wanted to get away from this idea of thought police, whether it's done by the religious right or done by the woke left. I decided that I'm just going to say how I see it and I'm going to open my mind and not shutter my mind to a viewpoint that might be hard for me to accept. And so once you can cross that line, tell yourself that, I think it'll open your mind to all sorts of things. And I think this is one of those things. It's not about, for most people, it's a jumble of thoughts. They haven't thought this through and they don't allow themselves to do that. So I think you just need to say, let me be truly open-minded about this.
Yeah.
Go through the arguments, look for the best counter arguments, and stick with one. The other thing is, I think as an academic, you're trained to think in a philosophical way where you take one argument and you see, can it stand up to rigorous scrutiny? You can't use the kitchen sink approach where it's just a bunch of bad arguments and kind of see what sticks.
Right.
So that's what I would argue. Look for even one strong argument that you can swallow that would lead you to a pro-choice viewpoint. And I think that's going to be hard for most people. I don't think it's impossible because there are certain bitter pills you could swallow, which is basically accepting infanticide in certain circumstances. If you can swallow that, I think you can come to a consistent position. But if you're against infanticide in all situations, then I think it's very hard for you to take a pro-choice position in a consistent way.
So I will close with this. Dr. Javad Hashmi, you are an incredibly accomplished person and have done so many amazing things. And I am so supportive of the project that you are working on. But I'll tell you, what you just described in my book is one of the most impressive things about you. And you don't have to go to Harvard or Berkeley to do that, to be open-minded. But the fact that you did that of like, I don't want to let thought police, I don't want, whether it's the religious right or the woke left or whatever, like I don't want them controlling me. I'm going to really rethink my views, even if it's really uncomfortable. That in my book is one of the most impressive things that you've ever done. And I'm so glad to know you. Thank you so much for coming on today.
I'm really appreciative. Thanks so much. And the last thing I wanted to say is follow me on Twitter, Dr. Javad T. Hashmi. If you don't mind putting that in the link, I'm always hungry for followers. Thanks so much.
Thank you.